The word foresight is a bit tricky. For foresight professionals, such as I know many of you are, the word may mean the full discipline of foresight, the set of methodologies ranging from weak signal and horizon scanning, wildcards, trend radars, scenario planning, and all of that. But that's not what I'll be addressing today. I will not be going into too much of those, say, methodologies, but I'll rather stay with the concept and the fundamental need for foresight and futures intelligence in a broader sense. You need to be tracking and making sense of all the change around you, upcoming, and trying to at least outline some type of, say, intelligent guesses as to how your competitive landscape is changing and even how your business environment might develop over the long run also. So this fundamental need for foresight and intelligence is something that I'm addressing today. And in specific, I'll try and address the question of how to really organize for this work in a corporate setting. My presentation builds on my own personal experience from working with dozens of companies in their different stages of maturity. And some parts of my presentation also builds on certain practitioner surveys that my company ran just early 2020. This is just before the pandemic. I'll first outline what I call the 5 ground rules for organizing for foresight. And then I'll introduce what I call distributed foresight, which I believe to be a sort of an ideal target state of really organizing for this work in a corporate setting. And finally, a very quick summary into my presentation. Excuse me. Now, without further ado, let me introduce ground rule number 1. Ground rule number 1 says, working with foresight and futures intelligence, you need to establish a continuous mode of work. There's perhaps nothing fundamentally wrong with, for example, with building your alternative future scenarios for your, say, yearly strategy boot camp. It's just that if you do this one-time or yearly effort, you risk either of the two. One, you only use those scenarios for that one-time effort and then they are forgotten. And the other one is that those scenarios and those summaries are at such a high level, not in enough of detail, so that they fail in offering real guidance for real decision making that you would need to do to accomplish something. So I heavily recommend going for a continuous mode of work. Your foresight work may be connected to strategic planning, innovation, risk management, R&D, or another key process, right? I heavily recommend having all your foresight, say, building blocks built into a continuous mode. Collecting of inputs from a variety of sources, continuously making sense out of those, and continuously summarizing and sharing your current understanding. I mean, with that example of the strategy bootcamp, if you just spent 1 month for compiling and generating and creating your, say, future scenarios for that strategy bootcamp, I mean, let me ask you a question. Why would you not spend the other 11 months of the year continuously collecting inputs, continuously improving your sense making, continuously summarizing and making sure your current understanding is also shared to the stakeholders and to the key processes that this work is supposed to be serving? Why would you not spend the other 11 months also in that work? So I heavily recommend going for a continuous mode of work. This is ground rule number 1. Ground rule number 2 says, make sure your foresight work is action-oriented. I think most or many intelligence functions during the past decades really have struggled with this, becoming isolated units or entities, creating a lot of knowledge, still failing to have an impact because they are not connected to action. In our 2020 survey to practitioners, we asked a number of questions of how you do your foresight and futures intelligence in your organization. We also asked whether you are happy with the way you've currently organized for this work. And turns out that by far the most significant contributor to whether the organization is happy with their ways of working today is systematically using those new insights, connecting it with action. This is number one contributor to satisfaction, that you continuously and systematically use those new insights. And depending on the context of your work, of your foresight work, such action-orientedness may have different forms. So if your work is related to strategic planning, then your collecting of inputs, your sense-making, your summarization needs to happen with that full context, right? Ending up with potential new strategic options, starting from your current strategic choices already in there, but ending up with identifying perhaps new strategic options, questions, risks, perhaps your future alternative scenarios of that business environment of yours. Ending up with the actions of taking decisions, but actually updating your strategies, actually testing your strategy, actually doing those investment decisions or whatever it may be. Whereas if your foresight work is, as another example only, if this work is supposed to be serving for an individual innovation project, for example, then again, the collecting of inputs, the sense-making, the action-orientedness needs to happen in that context. Obviously, the action to follow is different from what the action might be if you're dealing with your strategic planning overall. Sort of a side note, I believe that both sides of, say, strategic foresight and foresight for innovation can be jointly organized for, but that's slightly a different thing. The ground rule I'm trying to make here is that make sure your foresight work is connected with action, because this work really has no standalone value. It needs to be serving the processes it's supposed to be serving. Ground rule number 3, and yes, I suppose this may sound a bit naive, but with big corporations, this is not a simple thing. You should use some type of a central repository for your accumulated inputs. Again, referring to our 2020 survey, the happy ones, the ones that are somewhat content with the ways they today work with their foresight, 2 more contributors to their satisfaction. One is that you don't rely on one source of inputs. You use a lot of different sources of inputs. You get inputs from your own people. You buy them from consultants. You search for free trend reports. What I'm saying, you need a versatile set of inputs. Even more important is that you actually collect those inputs, not just gather and spread, not just finding news articles and finding trend reports and sending them via email or another, say, messaging tool, because you end up not accumulating all of that knowledge. So you need to organize for a central repository of some kind where you can accumulate all the knowledge, and enrich all the information, discuss it, and make sense out of it. That was ground rule number 3. Ground rule number 4 says you should at least consider applying some type of a preset model or models for your continuous sense making. A model, a framework, a template. Could be a trend radar overview. Doesn't need to be a trend radar overview. I'm not saying that. But again, in our 2020 survey, the happy ones, where they differentiate from the unhappy ones, is that in addition to ad hoc analyses and summaries, they also tend to use a sort of a permanent framework, such as a trend radar or another framework or a template or a model for the continuous sense making, which enables for a couple of things. First, it enables using such a framework as indeed a frame of reference for discussions across your different business units. It's a shared template. Everybody, are familiar with it. It allows for the continuity of work, where your current understanding is sort of mapped on this framework, where you can fit in your new incoming inputs and understanding, where you can iterate over your understanding, you can enrich the already existing information. And if done right, such a framework also helps you in identifying your own blind spots. So you should heavily recommend using some type of a set of preset models for your continuous sense making. One more thing about that. Such a commonly shared framework also helps in bringing more people on board to the continuous discussion, which now takes me to the ground rule number 5. Thing is, foresight, futures intelligence, innovation may be about intelligent tools and processes and all of that, sure, but it's not all about that. It's also about imagination, innovativeness, creativity, passion, commitment, ideation. It's about people. It's about people. And I think you should allow people to contribute. And there are people that are already contributing in excess of what is exactly expected from them in their daily working roles. There are already people who share those news pieces they find, right? Who open up discussions, who ask the questions that were not asked before. There are these people already because they want to contribute. They want to participate into something that they feel is meaningful. And I think you should allow for that. I think you should allow for building things also bottom up and not just, strictly top down. See, such a contribution from people comes because they want to. It doesn't come because of your systems and processes and hierarchies. It doesn't happen because of that. Such a contribution takes place despite the fact that you have processes and tools and hierarchies. And I really recommend you considering allowing for such a contribution and really building a community of contribution and discussion to make sense of what's already there in the, crowd intelligence of your own people. Why not extending that crowd even beyond your own company boundaries, bringing in on board your peers, your customers, your partners as well? A customer of ours, not too long ago, said, and I quote, "They're doing foresight already, they just don't know it yet." Now, this is a foresight team lead at a major corporation, but he was not referring to his colleagues in a central foresight team. Instead, he was referring to their research personnel. This is a technology-heavy company doing basic research in biochemistry and all of that. I don't understand what they're doing, but still. Now, this gentleman, he was referring to the research personnel, meaning that if the foresight team can tap into the knowledge, the inputs, the people are in their research roles are working with any ways to contribute to that one project, if they can simultaneously, contribute to the top level, say, foresight activities, then this would, take them onto a very, very, very nice path where, building such a community where people who are already contributing could really be taking part of that corporate foresight action as well. Now, that concludes my 5 ground rules. And now I'll walk you through with a concept or a model of distributed foresight, which I indeed believe to be some sort of a, say, ideal target state, building on the common denominators that at least I've seen with the successful implementations of foresight in corporate settings. I call it distributed foresight because it combines elements of a decentralized process with those of central coordination. See, you need those decentralized parts. You need that business unit level or innovation program level participation into foresight. You need that decentralized interpretation of foresight specific to a given role of a unit, for example, because that's where the action is. That's where the action is. That's where the decisions are taken, so you need to make sure those are involved. But then you also need that some type of a central element for coordination, but also you need an element that looks around more widely. Not limited by the sometimes a bit, narrow scopes of a given business unit, for example. Somebody to look across industry boundaries, to look across, independent of your current business structures and so on. And both elements can contribute to the work of the others and benefit from the work of the others. And I believe both these elements should interact and integrate with the top-level strategic discussion and decision-making, which should be steered both by the wide perspectives and by those more context-specific interpretations of foresight and futures intelligence. And to make the picture, say, full, there's one corner missing, and I say this is the place where you can, and I really think you should fit in, allow for that contribution from a network of people, not tied exactly to hierarchical structures, but those contributors who are in their daily working roles are already anyways scanning, monitoring, seeing findings that you should make it easy for them to contribute to this network of information, to this network of sense-making. It will require that central repository of some kind that was already mentioned under one of my ground rules for that accumulated knowledge, transparency, continuous discussion, and so on. Other than that, I believe this type of a model addresses most of my main ground rules. Such a model enables continuity. Such a model enables wide perspective. It may require those common templates. It enables continuously improving understanding, using multiple sources, and so on and so on. So I heavily recommend looking into this, say, model of distributed foresight, like I call it. So, in a quick summary, what I'm saying here is you should establish a continuous mode of work. You should make sure your foresight is action-oriented because there simply is no standalone value with this work. It needs to be connected to action. you should use some type of a central repository for those accumulated inputs, because other than that, it's going to be really, really hard. Apply preset models for continuous sense-making, and build a community and tap into that, let's call it crowd intelligence of your own people, and why not seeking even beyond your own company boundaries. And finally, this distributed foresight, I believe, really can be a sort of an ideal target state for organizing for the work.